I want to kick out straight with something very important, the Israel-Gaza war. On October 7, 2023, you tweeted, "Give them hell, Netanyahu." Since October 7, 50,000 Palestinians have died, 13,000 children, almost 97,000 injured. United Nations, human rights organizations such as Amnesty International have all declared this as one of the genocide of the 21st century. Are you satisfied with your tweet? And did you get what you're asking for?
Well, you might describe that as a loaded question. I would say that I'm not satisfied about anything that's happened on October 7th or in the aftermath. You'd have to be a fool to be satisfied with it. So, of course I'm not satisfied. What was the appropriate response to October 7th? Bring out the feather bed? The kid gloves? Not precisely. What happened on October 7th was a catastrophe. And it was obviously not something that could be ignored. And you might say, well, what's the right way forward? Well, there's a Canadian poet, Leonard Cohen, he said, "There's no decent place to stand in a massacre." You can find yourself in a situation where there have been so many mistakes made by you and by everyone around you that all of your alternatives are horrible. And that's what happens when war breaks out. And so, no, you'd be a fool to be satisfied with that. But there are situations where all the options are terrible. And you might say, well, how did those situations come about? And you'll certainly experience this in your own life. If you aim badly enough and you make enough mistakes, especially mistakes that are part and parcel of your own blindness and foolishness, you'll find yourself in a situation where, well, it's a situation that's akin to hell. Well, every single option in front of you is brutal and awful. And so how do you endeavor to conduct yourself so that you don't find yourself there? It's like you watch your bloody step and you keep your eyes open and you pray that you're not foolish enough to embroil yourself in some catastrophe. And so, well, we're way past that whenever a war breaks out, obviously. There wouldn't be a war, I suppose, as well, as if people didn't disagree profoundly about how they might proceed. And it's not like I have any simple solutions to the constant catastrophe of the Middle East, and neither does anyone else. But I guess I suppose that's also why I'm interested in psychology more than politics, because I actually think that the solution to such things is worked out at the level of the individual and not at the level of the state, even though the state has to involve itself, I suppose, when individual responsibility is abdicated. So no, of course I'm not satisfied. Who would be satisfied? So
I want to follow up more on an ideological question there as well. You have outspoken about censorship, ideological conformity, and authoritarianism, especially when it comes to free speech, the ability to say what you want, to stand for things. But one thing, especially within the Western ideals, we have seen a double standard when it comes to critiques and those vocal voices speaking for Palestinian rights. In the last 2 years, students protesting, protests have been curbed, mass surveillances, whether in the UK or the United States. Why have you not condemned this suppression of free speech? Is this not a textbook case
There's
of
been very little bloody evidence of free speech suppression, for example, in this issue. In my country, in Canada, there's been a plethora of demonstrations on the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine side. And so the idea that that's been squelched somehow is preposterous. There were literal encampments for months in my university, in University of Toronto. And I can't imagine a situation where a more contentious issue had been allowed more free expression than the protests that emerged in the aftermath of October 7th. So I see no evidence whatsoever for a double standard. Quite the contrary, I would say. In the West, there's been more freedom of speech for the purveyors of the pro-Palestinian message than there are in many Arab countries, for example. And so I don't see for a second that there's a double standard. Now, does that mean that there's even-handed and perfect justice at every moment with regards to all of the elements of discourse around October 7th? Well, obviously not, because nothing is perfect, but to construe that as prejudice on the part of the West, particularly in relationship to the legacy media of the universities, if anything, they've erred on the opposite side. And we've seen a dreadful rise in, say, anti-Semitic sentiment and so forth in the aftermath of October 7th. So I think the notion that there's a double standard that's differentially punished those who rose to support the Palestinian cause, I think that's a preposterous claim. I don't see any evidence for that at all.
Well, let me give you some evidence. I mean, supporters of Palestinians, especially students in the US and this country, were blacklisted. In Harvard, Columbia, students were not allowed to graduate. They were not given their degrees just for the sake of protesting outside universities. Surely these are examples of double standards.
It wasn't a consequence of protesting. It was a consequence of conducting themselves in an absolutely atrocious manner. There's rules of conduct for protest, and the students did everything they could to provoke the authorities, most of whom are in an ideological position to support the protest movements that we described a priori. They behaved so atrociously that even the idiot authorities who were charged with regulating the behavior of students on campus were finally forced to do something about it. It had nothing to do with differential treatment of the protesters. I mean, how long were there encampments at the University of Toronto? Like 3 months? Like, that's not tolerance, and that's not even free speech. That's weakness in the face of, it's weakness in the face of preposterously narcissistic and coercive behavior. And so I don't buy any of the presumptions that underlie that question.
Did you support the rioters of January 6th, Trump supporters, and the way they were treated?
Well, my sense of January 6th was that it was perfectly fine for the leftists to have an insurrection at the drop of a hat, but if the conservatives ever dared to have anything approximating protest, then all hell was going to break loose. Exactly the same thing happened with the trucker convoy in Canada. It's like the left can agitate ad nauseum, as they most certainly do at the drop of a hat, burn down the centers of cities in the United States, and all that's well and good. But if the conservatives ever dare to have anything approximating a protest, then, you know, we're going to have a fit about it for years and punish them as severely as possible. And I actually think there's some logic to that, because it doesn't take any provocation to what would you say, motivate leftist utopians to protest in the street, because that's core to their identity and everyone expects it. But you really have to torture conservatives to death before they'll do anything remotely resembling a protest. And if they do, it is time to get nervous, because when conservatives protest, they're actually pretty damn serious about it, because they've been pushed beyond the limits of their tolerance. And we certainly saw that with regards to the trucker convoy in Canada, which was clamped down on in a manner that was so appalling that it embarrasses me to be a citizen of my own country. Our bloody government took their bank accounts. I can't believe how despicable that was, and absolutely in keeping with what you'd expect from that pack of preposterous, utopian, naive, delusional minions that surrounded Trudeau. And he devastated Canada's reputation among sensible people on the international scene, because even people who might have been disinclined to agree with the truckers on ideological grounds, even though it wasn't an ideological movement, and it certainly wasn't an insurrection, they were still shocked to see that the government would seize the bank accounts even of ordinary people who dared to provide them with money, even in small amounts. And so, no doubt there were mistakes made by the protesters on January 6th, but there was a disproportionate response to their protests, especially in the aftermath of like an infinite series of Black Lives Matters riots across the United States. And so
So just let me get it right. So isn't there a stark contradiction when the right protests and there's a clampdown on the right, then there are mistakes being made, but there's no reaction, there's clampdown. But when the students did, it was the problem the students, not the authorities. There's a stark contradiction when you're applying this principle.
Well, I don't think the students were clamped down on to any great degree. I mean, not until, as I said, they'd misbehaved for a very long time. And it's certainly the case that across the United States in particular, and I would also say the same situation obtained in the UK and Canada, the leftist protesters have an unbelievably wide margin of freedom. And far more than, I mean, in Canada, for example, I have to remember the precise nature of the circumstances. I don't know if I can. I was informed by one of the podcast guests I had was a young man who had been expelled from his high school for making the provocative claim that God had created men and women separately and finally. And when protests emerged around him, Josh Alexander, that's right, the police faced him and his supporters and turned their backs to the radical Antifa leftists who were protesting really the mere fact of his existence. And that's pretty standard practice in Canada. He's a very brave young man. He's only 15 or 16, pretty upright character. He's an evangelical Christian, and perhaps people might take offense to that, but you'd be a fool if you doubted his courage. And the police in Canada set themselves against him and supported the Antifa protester types who were attempting to pillory him. And I'm not a fan of the Antifa types. I think in the main they're cluster B, narcissistic psychopaths. And the fact that the police would reflexively regard them as allies, as did the Socialist Party leader in Canada, who made physical gestures of threat towards Josh Alexander, indicates very strongly in what direction the authorities, the good-thinking authorities, are actually tilted. So